Welcome back to Crime Documentary Files. In today's video, we will explore two consecutive criminal cases that took place in South Korea. In the early morning hours of June 8th, 2005, at an apartment building in Yongdo District, Busan, South Korea, Mr. Jinwoo was busy preparing to open his Chinese restaurant on the first floor. That morning, the floor above seemed unusually noisy, as if someone was visiting. Loud banging echoed from upstairs. Bang! 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 Followed by a voice calling, "Jae-soo! Are you in there?" After a few minutes, the visitor gave up and left. Shortly after, the restaurant phone rang. Since it was too early for takeout orders, Mr. Jinwoo picked up the call. On the other end was Mr. Lee, 67 years old, who lived in the apartment upstairs. His voice sounded concerned. "Hey, could you come up to my place for a moment? I can't get in touch with my wife." Mr. Lee lived in a different area during the week due to work, only meeting his 63-year-old wife, Jae-soo, on weekends. Normally, she came home late after finishing work. Since she lived alone during the week, he made it a habit to call her every other day. But that morning, from the early hours, he had been unable to reach her. Both her landline and mobile phone were unresponsive. Before calling the Chinese restaurant owner, Mr. Lee had already asked his close friend of 30 years, Mr. Kwon, who lived nearby, to check on his wife. Mr. Kwon was the one banging on the door earlier, but he received no response, and the door was locked. Concerned, Mr. Jinwoo ended the call, got up, and took an internal stairway leading to the second floor, a hidden passage that connected the restaurant below with the residential unit above. As soon as he entered the apartment, he was met with total darkness. While moving forward, he suddenly felt a sticky liquid beneath his feet. Looking down, he realized the floor was covered in a pool of fresh blood. Sensing something was terribly wrong, he hurried toward the bedroom. Inside, a pile of clothes and blankets had been deliberately stacked on the bed. Someone had intentionally covered something up. As he carefully removed the layers, he uncovered the bloodied body of a woman underneath. Police arrived shortly after receiving the emergency report. Even for seasoned investigators, the crime scene was beyond gruesome. Mrs. Jae-soo had been brutally stabbed all over her body. A total of 25 stab wounds were found, 14 of them concentrated on her head. The entire room was in disarray, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. Defensive wounds were found on her arms, proving she had fought desperately to survive. Another disturbing discovery was that the apartment's electrical breaker had been turned off. It appeared the killer cut the power to delay the discovery of the crime scene. An autopsy later revealed that the victim had scratched the killer, leaving skin tissue under her right fingernails. Fortunately, DNA samples were recovered, confirming that the suspect was an adult male. Aside from the DNA, only one other clue was found, a star-shaped shoe print on the floor. However, there was something odd. The shoe size measured only 240 millimeters, US size 6, which was far too small for an adult male, contradicting the DNA results. Investigators noted that the victim's clothes were still the same as when she left for work, suggesting that the attack occurred around 1:30 a.m., just as she had returned home. This meant that Mrs. Jae-soo's work hours were different from typical office workers. Could the killer have known her routine well enough to time the attack so precisely? Could the murderer have been someone close to her? Although the case could initially be suspected as a robbery, there were no signs of forced entry or missing valuables. The killer must have entered through the front door and was willingly let in even in the middle of the night, further reinforcing the theory that the perpetrator was someone the victim knew. Because of this, the police focused their investigation on the people around the victim. The first person to be questioned was her husband, Mr. Lee. However, since he was in a different region at the time of the crime, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. The issue was that no other obvious suspect emerged. Mrs. Jae-soo did not seem to have any known enemies. However, one suspicious detail surfaced in her financial records. She had borrowed 100 million won from Mr. Kwon, her husband's close friend, the same man who had been banging on her door that morning. When such a large sum of money is involved, the relationship between Mrs. Jae-soo and Mr. Kwon appeared to be more than just financial. Their frequent late-night phone calls further supported this. Additionally, Mr. Kwon displayed highly unusual behavior at her funeral. Despite being only a friend of the victim's husband, he held her memorial portrait and sobbed uncontrollably, closely monitoring the funeral proceedings as if he were a grieving family member. As suspicions grew, a close friend of the victim secretly approached the police. After cautiously looking around, she revealed they were having an affair for a long time. The investigation confirmed that the two had been in an extramarital relationship since 2000, lasting until the time of the crime, a span of 5 years. This meant that Mr. Kwan had a clear motive for murder. When summoned for questioning, Mr. Kwan remained calm. He stated that at 1:30 a.m., the estimated time of the murder, he was asleep at home. The next morning, upon his friend's request, he went to Mrs. Jae-soo's home. Beyond that, he had nothing more to explain. Indeed, many people had witnessed him urgently knocking on her door that morning. However, his alibi for 1:30 a.m. remained unverified. He claimed to be sleeping alone, but since he lived by himself, there was no way to confirm this. Looking at Mr. Kwan's background, he appeared to be a man in his 60s with thinning hair, working as a carpenter and living a frugal life. It was difficult to imagine him brutally murdering his lover, who was also his friend's wife, only to continue living normally afterward. At his age, the idea that he had violently slaughtered Mrs. Jae-soo in such a gruesome manner made police hesitant. While they knew appearances do not determine guilt, they continued to monitor and investigate him further. Then, a shocking truth emerged. Mr. Kwan's wife, Mrs. Sun, had been missing for 3 years. According to Mr. Kwan, on October 28, 2002, after an argument over his gambling habits, his wife left home and never returned. He made no effort to find her and only reported her missing 5 days later. A deeper investigation revealed several inconsistencies in Mrs. Sun's disappearance. Although she was known to be furious over her husband's gambling, she was also a devoted mother and grandmother. No matter how angry she might have been, the fact that she never contacted her family for years was highly suspicious. Even more troubling, her wallet and mobile phone, 2 essential personal belongings, were still left at home. Meanwhile, suspicious behavior from Mr. Kwan also came to light. Shortly after his wife disappeared, he contacted an insurance company to inquire about collecting life insurance benefits in cases of missing persons or runaways. According to regulations, after 5 years and 6 months of reported disappearance, he would be eligible to receive approximately 40 million won in missing person insurance payouts. Additionally, he purchased accident and cancer insurance policies under his wife's name from 4 different insurance companies. For 2.5 years, he consistently paid 200,000 won per month in premiums. This was highly unusual, considering Mr. Kwan was a carpenter, not a wealthy man, yet he persistently continued paying for insurance on his missing wife. To summarize, his wife vanished, and his mistress was murdered, an undeniable pattern of suspicious circumstances. This was not a coincidence. The police summoned Mr. Kwan for questioning once again, carefully observing his reactions. If he were hiding something, his body language or gaze would betray him. The investigators asked, "Today, we're not here to ask about Mrs. Seo. We want to talk about your missing wife. What was your relationship like?" When the conversation took an unexpected turn, Mr. Kwan became visibly flustered. He insisted that their marriage was fine and there were no problems, yet his eyes darted around nervously. The investigator pressed further. "Neighbors reported that you two often argued. And why would your wife leave behind her wallet and phone if she voluntarily left?" Mr. Kwan began to panic. At that moment, a sharp-witted investigator handed him a glass of water and said, "Here, have some water." When Mr. Kwan reached out to grab the glass, his hands were trembling uncontrollably. With these clear signs of distress, it became evident that he was involved in the deaths of both women. The challenge now was proving it with concrete evidence. The police collected a DNA sample from Mr. Kwan and sent it to the National Forensic Service. The results confirmed that the DNA found under Mrs. Jae-soo's fingernails was a perfect match to Mr. Kwan's DNA. But was that enough to convict him? No, it wasn't. DNA evidence only proved physical contact and a struggle, not murder. If he denied everything, the case would hit a dead end. Finally, investigators decided to change their approach and convince Mr. Kwon to confess voluntarily. They exploited his deep Buddhist beliefs. They told him, "If you don't confess and clear your karma now, you will suffer even in the afterlife." Isn't being a respectable father to your children one of the core teachings of Buddhism? After several days of psychological persuasion, Mr. Kwon finally broke down and began revealing the truth. First, about Mrs. Seo. Since their affair began in 2000, for over 4 years, Mr. Kwon had been giving her a monthly allowance. In 2003, he even lent her 100 million won, which explained the financial debt between them. However, from the second half of 2004, Mr. Kwon's financial situation deteriorated. His work slowed down, his car was repossessed, and his son's business failed, leaving him in desperate need of money. In the end, he begged Mrs. Jae-soo to return at least part of the 100 million won he had lent her. But she refused, saying she had already spent the money on urgent matters and demanded more time. Her attitude toward him grew colder, and she became increasingly irritated whenever he asked for the money back. By mid-May 2005, after 5 years of knowing each other, tensions between them reached a breaking point. Despite his repeated pleas, Mrs. Jae-soo stood firm and refused to pay him back. Feeling angry and betrayed, Mr. Kwon snapped. One day, he slapped Mrs. Seo across the face. Mrs. Jae-soo laughed mockingly and said, "Did you just hit me? Is this how you treated your wife too?" Her words sent a chill down Mr. Kwon's spine. He thought to himself, "Does she know what I did to my wife? If so, I won't just lose the 100 million won, I'll be exposed for my crime." In the end, he decided to kill Mrs. Jae-soo to silence her. In reality, she had only mentioned his wife out of anger after being slapped, but his guilty conscience made him panic. His first attempt to kill her failed. At 2 a.m. on May 28, 2005, knowing her daily routine, he broke into her home while she was asleep, poured gasoline at the entrance, and set it on fire. However, Mrs. Jae-soo woke up due to the smoke and called 119, South Korea's emergency services, foiling his plan. At the time, she suspected Mr. Kwon was behind the arson, but he denied everything. To avoid suspicion, he even pretended to be helpful, offering to help clean up the damage. 10 days later, on June 8th, he tried again. Around 1 a.m., he waited for Mrs. Jae-soo to return home from work, hiding a knife on his person. When she arrived, he once again demanded she pay back at least 5 million won. Exhausted from her shift, she told him, "Let me sleep first, we'll talk later." But he followed her inside the house. At 2 a.m., when she had fallen into a deep sleep, he pulled out his knife and stabbed her repeatedly. As she fought back, she grabbed his arm, trapping his skin tissue under her nails. Shortly after, she took her final breath. After the murder, Mr. Kwon carefully covered up the evidence. To mislead the investigation, he wore shoes that were 240 millimeters, US size 6, much smaller than his actual size, and deliberately left footprints throughout the scene. He then disposed of his blood-stained clothes and the knife on a hillside nearby. As for his bloody gloves, he cut them into small pieces and flushed them down the toilet. The next morning, in an attempt to establish an alibi, he deliberately went to the district office early to complete personal paperwork, ensuring his name would be recorded in the system with a timestamp. Later, when his friend, Mrs. Jae-soo's husband, called, saying he couldn't reach his wife and asked him to check on her, he casually went to the house knowing exactly what had happened. He banged on the door loudly, shouting, "Jae-soo, are you in there?" He made sure to call her name loud enough for the downstairs neighbors to hear, carefully staging the scene. From there, everything unfolded as we saw from the beginning. Now, back to the disappearance of his wife, Mrs. Sun. Mr. Kwon continued to deny any involvement in her vanishing. However, after relentless interrogation, he finally broke down. His chilling confession left everyone in shock. "My wife's body is buried under the floor of our house. For the past 3 years, he had been living in the same house with her corpse hidden beneath the floor. The police immediately rushed to his home in Yeongdo, Busan. They tore apart the concrete flooring in both the bedroom and the living room. What they uncovered was horrifying. Her head had been buried beneath the bedroom, while her dismembered body was buried under the living room. So what had really happened? On October 28, 2002, at the carpentry workshop behind their house, Mr. Kwon and his wife got into a heated argument. They had frequent fights about his gambling, but that day was particularly intense. Mrs. Sun lashed out, saying, "We're living in misery because you're useless." That sentence became the spark that ignited everything. As the head of the household, he could not tolerate being belittled. Overcome with rage and humiliation, he lost control and strangled his wife to death. Afterward, Mr. Kwon carefully planned how to cover up his crime. First, he wrapped the body in waterproof paper and buried it beneath the bedroom floor. 5 days later, he reported her missing. When the decomposing body began to emit a foul odor, he panicked and started thinking of a more permanent way to conceal the remains. 2.5 months later, in January 2003, he began a large-scale renovation of the house. As a carpenter with over 30 years of experience, he was capable of doing all the work himself. And he had to do it alone, because the real purpose was not home improvement, but hiding a body. Initially, he planned to bury the corpse near the entrance to the living room and pour cement over it. However, once he started, he realized the space was too small to fit the body. Ultimately, he decided to dismember his wife's remains for easier concealment. He separated her head from her torso, burying them separately, one in the bedroom, the other in the living room. He then covered the graves with soil, poured layers of cement, and meticulously sealed them with 2 to 3 additional coatings. His work was so precise that no odor leaked out. Even when his grown children and mistress visited, none of them noticed anything suspicious. The most disturbing detail was that he buried his wife's head in the bedroom, yet he continued sleeping there every night. At first, he slept directly on the floor above her grave. However, over time, the thought of it unsettled him, so he placed a bed over the burial site. Even more chilling. In his bedroom, he still displayed a framed photo of his happy family, featuring his murdered wife. Regarding his sentencing, unfortunately, media coverage of the trial was scarce. His heinous crimes, murdering both his wife and mistress, were fully exposed, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The public was shocked, only 15 years for taking 2 lives. That meant that by 2025, Mr. Kwon had completed his sentence and was released. After his release, his whereabouts remain unknown. For all we know, he could be living freely among society, as if nothing had ever happened. During the trial, Mr. Kwon showed no remorse. Instead, his biggest concern was this: "I planted flowers in my yard. Who's going to take care of them?" A bizarre and absurd statement in the face of such horrific crimes. At the time, his 15-year sentence sparked widespread outrage. Even today, it remains baffling, but once a court ruling is made, it cannot be changed. And that concludes this case. Now let's move on to the next gripping story. On April 13, 2014, the Paju police station received a missing person report. The report was filed by the missing man's son-in-law, who stated, "I haven't been able to contact my father-in-law for 2 days." The missing person was Mr. Sung, 72 years old. What made this case particularly unusual was that Mr. Sung was a well-known wealthy man in the area. He owned a significant amount of cash, land, and multiple properties under his name. Given his status, his disappearance was highly likely to be financially motivated. The police began their investigation by visiting Mr. Sung's home in Paju. After a thorough search, they found no signs of forced entry or missing valuables. However, one critical anomaly stood out. The security camera recorder, which Mr. Sung had installed throughout his home, was missing. When they tracked the last known signal from Mr. Sung's cell phone, they found that it led to an apartment complex in Paju. Through neighborhood inquiries, they uncovered a key piece of information. A 64-year-old woman named Bae, who had a close relationship with Mr. Sung, lived in that very apartment complex. As it turned out, they had been in a long-term romantic relationship. The police immediately visited Ms. Bae's apartment, but her reaction was suspicious. Typically, when law enforcement arrives unexpectedly, people react with surprise or concern. However, Ms. Bae remained incredibly calm and simply asked, "What's going on? Do you have a search warrant? If not, you can't come in." Although they had only intended to question her, her composure raised suspicions. The police then reviewed security footage from around the apartment complex, where Mr. Sung's last cell phone signal had been detected. Strangely, there was no footage of him entering the building. Meanwhile, irregularities were found in Mr. Sung's financial transactions. One day before he went missing, 14 million won was withdrawn from his credit card. After checking bank security footage, the police made a shocking discovery. The person who withdrew the money was not Mr. Sung, but a young woman in her early 20s. She used Mr. Sung's card and then transferred 6 million won into her own account. After an investigation, the account holder was identified as a 22-year-old woman named Yoona. Interestingly, she had left South Korea immediately after transferring the money, but she had booked a return flight, suggesting that it might have just been a personal trip. At this point, the police strongly suspected that Mr. Sung's disappearance was linked to a violent crime. They re-examined security footage near Ms. Bae's apartment and found a crucial piece of evidence they had missed earlier. 3 large men carrying an oversized suitcase into the elevator, heading up to Ms. Bae's floor. This suggested that Mr. Sung's body, or at least key evidence, was still inside Ms. Bae's apartment. Now certain of involvement in a criminal act, the police secured a search warrant and entered her residence. Ms. Bae lived in a 50-square-meter apartment, so packed with luxury goods and designer items that there was barely any space to walk. While searching, they discovered Mr. Sung's driver's license and 3 of his credit cards in her bedroom. On April 20th, the police arrested Ms. Bae as the prime suspect in Mr. Sung's abduction. During interrogation, she remained completely silent. However, a major breakthrough came when the police identified the rental car used by the men in the security footage. By tracking the license plate, they successfully identified one of the 3 men who carried the suitcase. Inside his personal vehicle, investigators found duct tape and rope, which were suspected to have been used in Mr. Sung's kidnapping. Additionally, they recovered the missing security camera recorder from Mr. Sung's home. This was clear evidence that the group had abducted Mr. Sung. They confessed to abducting Mr. Sung from the parking lot of his residence on the morning of April 11th. They then forced him into a suitcase and transported him to Ms. Bae's apartment. According to the kidnappers, Mr. Sung was held captive in Ms. Bae's bedroom, and there were other men stationed inside the apartment to guard him. As the police dug deeper into the case, they discovered that a total of 10 people were involved. The group consisted of 3 kidnappers, including a housekeeping center worker, an entertainment venue employee, and an unlicensed taxi operator. Most of them had criminal records and ties to the underground world. This shocked the police, but it also confirmed their suspicion. Ms. Bae was connected to far more dangerous and complex people than they had originally thought. While Ms. Bae, the prime suspect, continued to deny all accusations, her accomplices were gradually arrested one by one. Finally, 2 days after her arrest, she confessed to the crime. When asked about Mr. Sung's whereabouts, she admitted that on April 14th, just 1 day after he was reported missing, she and Kim, the housekeeping center worker, moved Mr. Sung to an office in Gangnam, Seoul. This meant that when police first visited Ms. Bae's apartment and she refused to let them in, Mr. Sung was still alive inside. The police had missed a crucial opportunity right in front of them. Immediately, they rushed to the Gangnam office, but Mr. Sung was nowhere to be found. However, they noticed an unusual cement structure in one corner of the room. There was also a strong odor of decomposition and dark red stains on the floor. When they broke open the cement, they found charred black chunks of coal, and finally, Mr. Sung's body. His corpse was wrapped in a large plastic bag, showing clear signs of strangulation. The The dark red stains on the floor were bodily fluids from his decomposing remains. At that moment, the case escalated from a missing person investigation to a full-blown murder case. But one critical question remained. Who was the killer? All male accomplices denied involvement in the murder, insisting they had only participated in the kidnapping. Security footage supported their claim, as it only showed them carrying the suitcase into the office before leaving. This put all suspicion directly on Ms. Bae. When confronted, she admitted to killing Mr. Sung herself. But was that really the truth? There was still one missing link. Yoo-na, the 22-year-old woman who withdrew money from Mr. Sung's credit card before fleeing the country. Investigators discovered that this woman played a much bigger role than they initially thought. According to the arrested accomplices, they were not hired by Ms. Bae. They were hired by Yoo-na. Yoo-na had posted online, looking for strong men to carry out an abduction. Kim, the housekeeping center worker, applied for the job and was told by Yoo-na, "There's an old rich man. If you help kidnap him, I'll split the money with you." The entertainment venue employees who participated were also acquaintances of Yoo-na. Even the leaseholder of the Gangnam office, where Mr. Sung's body was found, was none other than Yoo-na herself. The police set up an ambush at the airport, waiting for Yoo-na to return as per her pre-booked flight. As soon as she arrived, she was arrested on the spot. Once in custody, she confessed to the crime, but what she revealed next left everyone stunned. She and Ms. Bae were mother and daughter. More specifically, Yoo-na was Ms. Bae's daughter from a previous relationship with another man. Since this was never documented on paper, the police initially failed to connect them as family. The story traced back to 2005, 9 years before the murder. At the time, Ms. Bae ran a store inside a commercial building in Seoul. It was there that she met Mr. Sung, who also owned a shop in the same building. Back then, Mr. Sung was already married, while Ms. Bae was a single mother raising her daughter, Yoo-na. They became lovers, and Mr. Sung began taking care of Ms. Bae and her daughter as if they were his own family. However, in May 2013, Ms. Bae and her daughter's greed for Mr. Sung's wealth began to escalate. They deceived him with an elaborate lie. Ms. Bae told him, "My daughter's grandfather lives in the US and she is about to inherit billions of won. The amount is too large, so could you be her legal representative?" Mr. Sung fell for the story. The mother and daughter duo kept asking for money, claiming, "We need funds to change the legal representative, but we will return everything once we receive the inheritance." Through this scheme, they managed to swindle approximately 500 million won from him, but their greed didn't stop there. They kept demanding more and more money. Eventually, Mr. Sung realized something was off and began distancing himself from them. He decided to cut off their relationship, effectively terminating their financial support. At this point, Ms. Bae and her daughter became desperate. Ms. Bae tried demanding emotional compensation from him, but he refused to pay. This led them to take a far more ruthless approach. Ms. Bae lured Mr. Sung to her apartment in Paju. There, several men from a housekeeping center were already waiting. They beat and threatened him, forcing him to withdraw 23 million won. At the time, Mr. Sung didn't dare report it to the police due to his extramarital affair with Ms. Bae. The mother and daughter duo took advantage of this vulnerability. With 23 million won in hand, they realized they could take even more. So, they devised a larger plan, this time recruiting more people. Yoo-na, the daughter, personally hired men online to carry out the abduction. A shocking detail, Yoo-na was in her final month of pregnancy while plotting this crime. On the morning of April 11th, Mr. Sung was kidnapped and taken to Ms. Bae's apartment. The mother and daughter threatened him to reveal his ATM PIN and withdrew 14 million won. Shortly after, Yoo-na used part of this stolen money to travel abroad with her boyfriend. The day after the kidnapping, police arrived at Ms. Bae's apartment, but she refused to open the door. At that moment, Mr. Sung was still alive, being held captive inside. Fearing police intervention, Ms. Bae moved him to the Gangnam office that her daughter had rented for this crime. At dawn on April 15th, Ms. Bae made one final demand. She ordered Mr. Sung to hand over 100 million won as emotional compensation. When he refused to reveal his PIN, she strangled him to death with a rope. She then left his body in the living room near a window, built a brick enclosure around it, and poured cement over the remains to conceal them. To mask the odor of decomposition, she placed charcoal over the cement. Eventually, Ms. Bae, her daughter Yuna, and the 10 men involved in the crime were all arrested. Ms. Bae was charged with armed robbery, murder, fraud, and corpse concealment. Since Yuna didn't directly participate in the murder, she was only charged as an accomplice in corpse concealment. However, the trial was far from straightforward. In court, Ms. Bae claimed she was a victim. She alleged that Mr. Sung had sexually exploited her for years and that the 500 million won he gave her was voluntary compensation. Regarding the assault at her apartment, she blamed the housekeeping center workers, claiming they acted on their own after discovering Mr. Sung was wealthy. But despite her attempts to shift the blame, the court found her guilty. The first trial sentenced Ms. Bae to 30 years in prison, Yuna to 10 years in prison. Ms. Bae furiously appealed and even denied the murder, despite admitting to it during the initial investigation. She exploited the fact that the autopsy could not determine an exact cause of death, using it to alter her testimony. Additionally, Ms. Bae was caught secretly sending letters to her daughter from prison, instructing her to lie in court. The court discovered this through an inmate who acted as a messenger. When confronted, Ms. Bae denied writing the letters and even suggested that her daughter may have forged part of the content. During this process, Yuna found herself in an agonizing predicament, forced to confront her own mother in court. The emotional pressure became unbearable, even pushing her to the brink of suicide while in prison. Yet Ms. Bae remained ice cold, denying any knowledge of the letters she had secretly sent. It became painfully clear. To Ms. Bae, neither her lover, Mr. Sung, nor her own daughter, Yuna, mattered as much as money. After the conclusion of all trials, Ms. Bae was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Yuna received 10 years, just as originally ruled. The hired accomplices from the housekeeping center received prison terms ranging from 4 to 7 years. This case serves as a grim reminder. Uncontrolled greed can drive people to the depths of inhumanity. A man who once provided for others, who loved and cared for someone, was ultimately betrayed and brutally murdered by the very people he trusted the most. Their insatiable thirst for wealth blinded them, leading them to deceive, abduct, and even kill, all for money. But in the end, money can never buy true happiness. This case also exposes a bitter truth. When money becomes the only measure of worth, even family bonds can be traded away. Let this be a lesson. If greed goes unchecked, destruction is only a matter of time. That wraps up today's video. What do you think about these two shocking cases? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.